So today on the show, we're fortunate to have Rafael Pizano, who's here to tell us a little bit about what he has learned, and he's done a lot of study. He's covered a lot of ground. I've met with him a few times. He's sent me a lot of documents. Folks, I'm going to tell you what, we're going to have to do several shows with him because he has so much data and information to share with you, and you're not going to want to miss any of it. So I know we've got, I was told we've got most of West Tampa listening today, so welcome to the Morgan Streetman Show, folks. We're about to get right into it. Rafael, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Good morning.
Good morning. And I'd like for you to introduce yourself a little bit. And I also want you to introduce your father because you come from a long line of people who are freedom-minded and who've put their lives, including yourself, on the line for freedom. But tell us a little bit about your father and where he comes from.
Well, first, it's a real pleasure to be here with you gentlemen on the show. I'm American, first-generation American, born in Michigan. But most of my family, my entire family originally came from Cuba. They were escaping communism. They found exile here in the United States. They were received with open arms and given a chance to live in freedom. I was a U.S. Army paratrooper. I'm a veteran. Proudly served our nation. Served overseas, came back, tried a couple different things, and then found myself working as a first responder to continue to serve my great country here. During that time, over the last 8 to 10 years, I found myself carrying uniquely some type of a torch for my family and other families that came from escaping socialism and communism in Cuba, and I was raising awareness on human rights, particularly because my family suffered under socialism and communism in Cuba. My father spent 18 years as a political prisoner. Many of the men and women here in Tampa Bay from that Cuban-American community were former Bay of Pigs veterans. And after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, they came back, booted back up, and went to Vietnam. These were Cubans that became Cuban-Americans, and they went to Vietnam and continued to fight for the United States overseas in different theaters, and they've been proud to be part of this country. So I found myself inspired at an early young age to carry their message and to speak about what they endured on our socialist state in Cuba, how many men and women were executed with kangaroo courts and just no trials, mock trials. And I've taken this message to Latin America. I've taken it to Europe, Eastern Europe in particular, since they had their fall from the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s. And I've carried this message to different countries, and yet I found myself years later having to share the message back here at home, right here in Tampa, Florida, and here in the United States, because cultural Marxism tends to be taking a strong tide here. And it was just a unique situation. I find myself now preaching here to my fellow Americans.
Yeah, well, it's something they need to hear, and we've got so much more detail that we're going to get into when we get back. But, folks, if you want to get on the line with us, if you have any questions for Rafael, we'd love to hear from you, 888-404-1010. But we're going to jump right back into it on the other side of this break on the Morgan Streetman Show. And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show on this beautiful, dreary Monday morning here in Tampa Bay. Had a nice weekend over the weekend. I mean, it's awfully hot around here. I think we broke a heat record on Saturday. And, folks, if you live here in Tampa Bay area, you experienced that. You know what it was. I was sweating on Saturday. So Merry Christmas, right? It's going to be a, what do you call that? It's not a white Christmas around here. Anyway, today we've got a very special guest on the Morgan Streetman Show, as hopefully you've heard, hopefully not just joining us. But if you are, don't worry. We're going to cover so much information still in the rest of the show. Today we've got Rafael Pizano on. And he's been telling us a little bit about his background. Now, he was born here in the United States, but his father and his family came from Cuba. And his father has a very interesting story. He's very well known among the Cuban expatriate community here in the Tampa area and, frankly, statewide for some of his service to the cause of freedom and some of what he endured in Cuba. And, Rafael, you mentioned it, but I don't think it's you didn't really give us the details, and it's deserving of much more than a mention, the time that he spent in a Cuban prison. And, I would like you to share with the audience some more detail about that and also share with them some of what it's like to be held in a Cuban prison, because I get the feeling folks don't really have an idea. When they hear that, they don't really understand what that actually means for a person to be locked in a Cuban prison. Essentially, the key gets thrown away in these kind of regimes. They put you in the prison and they torture you, and it's an awful situation. So I want you to share some of those details, because I think folks don't really understand when we just say somebody was in prison. They don't really understand what that means, what they went through.
Absolutely. So my father, Roberto Pizano, he was a young man who loved his country like many people in their country there. They were very patriotic. They lived a humble island type of life. You know what I mean? Lots of people, lots of Americans would travel to Cuba in that era more than ever to see the island. It was a joyous place. They found themselves in a unique situation in the 50s where this character by the name of Fidel Castro came along preaching a message of giving things to everybody. You know, everybody was deserving and that the government was all bad, and he had the right answer and the quick fix pretty much. They saw a lot of flags come up, a lot of weird things that didn't make sense. The promises just seemed too good to be true. So as Castro started to entice people, they said, this message seems a lot, it seems Soviet-like. And lots of people said, oh, no, you're just, you're exaggerating. You guys just see communism everywhere because of the Soviet Union. What are you talking about? This is an island. Well, things started to change. Then the message started to get more aggressive on the people. And if you didn't agree with their message, which they would preach was the good message, then they would become aggressive against you, and you were the bad person if you didn't accept their message. Mm-hmm. So as things started to unfold in the mid-'50s, it started to take up arms. There was riots. There was a series of things. It became just explosive is what it did on this island. My father and many other men and women decided, you know what, this isn't the direction we want to go with this. We're going to oppose this every angle we got. Those persons that started to stand up against it found themselves being attacked in general by these groups, be it physically at one point. 1959, Fidel Castro rose into Havana, seizes power just forward, and now all rights are taken. All of a sudden, state media got under state control. It's pretty much what they wanted to put on the airs. They would air. It's all their opinions, and you got to like it, my way or the highway. And if you would try to stand up, if you would try to be vocal, if you would try to say something to the press, which was free before 1959, you found yourself now arrested. They would arrest you. They would throw you in prison. The prison systems are very different over there during that time. If you examine what happens in communist states once they take power, there is no real trial. There is no real defense. It's all like a kangaroo court. It's a big puppet game.
Right.
So my father decided, you know what? These people are in power. We have to stop this somehow. And many brave men and women decided to go to the hillside. Hey, we're going to go to arms too. We have to fight this tyranny. They were arrested. He was captured. He was shot in the head.
Ooh.
It didn't go in. It just scraped them. But that type of wound to the head really... He just passed out. When he woke up, they already had him detained. They pretty much tied him up and many of the other men that were with him, and he found himself in prison. There wasn't a real trial where he could have a defense. They just pretty much condemned him. His original sentence was to 30 years. In those 18 years that he served, and I'll get to why it was 18 later, he served 18 years in that prison. They had to go through horrific things. I mean, things we wouldn't understand. You would think people get 3 square meals in a prison, even if they did something supposedly wrong, because in this sense, they didn't do anything but stand up for their country and the values that it represented.
Yeah, they're not applying the Geneva Convention, right, in those prisons. They're not. It's not like a U.S. prison. We even hear about some abuses in U.S. prisons, but Absolutely. At least in U.S. prisons, there's a degree of human rights. Now you're talking about a prison where there are no human rights. In fact, it's like the Soviet Union. You become a non-person.
Absolutely. There is no Red Cross there. They don't allow it. To this day, the Red Cross or Amnesty International, till this very day, we've requested you cannot visit political prisoners in those prisons.
And you don't hear them, by the way, howling about that, do you? You don't hear Amnesty. They should be trumpeting that 24/7, but you don't hear that. And you wonder, why is that? Do some of these groups have an interest in supporting regimes like this? But please continue.
Absolutely. So they just found themselves in a prison here. Their visitation rights were stripped away. My grandmother were to go to visit him, and they'll intentionally put you on the other side of the island. So transportation was very difficult. My grandmother would have to travel at extreme lengths and just walk distances what they would do. And when they would get there, they'll just out of the blue make them wait for several hours and just out of the blue tell them, hey, no visitation today.
Yeah.
Too bad. And it was a part of psychological warfare to affect them.
Now, let me ask you, what's the name of this prison where your father was kept?
Well, there's Isla de Pino, Isles of Pines, which they would call it, but there were several throughout the island. They're very big prisons. There's about half a dozen that were the major ones, and then they'll have some in different areas, just mini hubs, you would call them, until they send them to the larger prison where they'll be serving those 30-year sentence or 25-year sentences.
And have you ever been to this? Do you ever get the opportunity to go to this prison? Probably not.
I have not.
Okay.
Me personally, you're saying?
Yes, I was just
I have
wondering.
not. I have photographs. I have many photographs that I have from those prisons to kind of see what the way of life was. It was just a weird thing to see those photographs. It's a very eerie feeling just to see them. These aren't like courtyards where people kind of play basketball or anything. I mean, it's just the conditions were just horrific. And again, reverting back to the stories, I mean, my father left that prison weighing 105 pounds.
Wow.
The interrogations, it'll be random. My father told me a particular story that always stood out. It raises the hair on the back of my neck, that he was in his cell and down the hallway, he could hear, this was the middle of the night, the head prison person, like the ward, the head guards and so forth, with a psychologist that came in there, a very high-ranking official, but was a psychologist as well. And he was telling the guards, almost like annoyed and disappointed, hey, you guys are pushing these guys too far. The point is to push them to the point of insanity. You guys are just pushing them too far. They're going insane. So some of these men were in their cells, and not to be too graphic, but one of these men, my father said, was drinking his own urine and eating his feces in a corner. And he later miraculously was able to get better and kind of have a regular life, that gentleman. But these were many of the cases. They were trying to squeeze people to force them to re-education. They use that title throughout, communist gulags and stuff like that. They re-educate you. It's pretty much as you're going to accept their message and not be against it. So this re-education program would drive people insane. The first work labor camps, oh man, hundreds and hundreds of men would be sent out to these fields. And it was an idle job. It wasn't anything productive. It was just to force them to labor out in the heat all day. They'll have, similar to World War II Japanese-style hot boxes. So it'll be like these 10 little boxes. And they'll stick you out there in the heat all day to really dehydrate you, and they'll keep you out there. Some men were pushed through bayonets. This is how they would force you to keep working. And the psychological way that they would do this is, well, you don't want to work, we're going to stab your buddy. So it's not like you would say, okay, you want to stab me. No, they're going to stab your buddy. And your buddy has a wife and 2 or 3 children that have gone to visitations at times when they allow it. So now you have to say, well, am I going to let this happen to this man? Because it's not like they're doing it to me and it's my will. I'm hurting this man. He's not going to see his family. So you keep working this idle job, which is just really to try to break you down morally and just break your will. And many of these men did not allow their will to be broken.
Yeah. Well, it's a very sophisticated psychological torture that they employ, is what you're describing. And, it's the same in communist prisons around the world. I mean, we see the same thing deployed, for instance, in Romania with Richard Wurmbrand, who then founded the Voice of the Martyrs, when he was tortured because of his Christian ministry, which, of course, is not allowed under communism.
No, it is not.
Christianity and other religions are not, because under communism, the state is God.
Yes.
It's an atheistic mindset, but they substitute the state and really more than even just the state, the party, right? Because it's really the Communist Party that becomes the god in those countries. And it's a very scary situation to live under, where you can't have the freedom. So we see it today in China in some of the ways that they treat their prisoners, who are, for instance, the Muslim Uyghurs. They've got them in re-education camps, and, of course, the detail is not allowed to be leaked out very much, but sometimes people do get some of the details out, and we hear that it's a very similar kind of thing to what your father went through. Last night, it was interesting. I was talking to somebody whose father also was in this exact same prison that your father was in, and this person was describing going there as a young child to visit her father. And, I mean, it was just heartbreaking to hear the stories, and it was the same prison that your dad was in. Luckily, her father was not in there for as long as your father was, although he was in there for several years. And it was really a terrible situation. But you can understand why when they got out, they fled that country and came to America, as Maximo Alvarez said during the RNC convention, the only place in the world where you could go and still have freedom. Well, we barely scratched the surface with you, but we're going to get right back into it on the other side of the break with a lot more detail. Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. We've got a great show for you today. I hope you're enjoying it. Folks listening from West Tampa today, welcome to the Morgan Streetman Show. We're glad to have you listening today. And this is just the beginning of a series of shows that we're going to do with Rafael Pizano. His father had such an interesting background as a freedom fighter in Cuba, tried to stand up to the Castro regime. And, you made an interesting point earlier I've actually been to Cuba. I went one time back when that was allowed. And, a lot of people get offended by that. They don't want you to go and stuff. I personally just kind of wanted to see what it was like down there. Of course, I know that for tourists, they put on the best show possible. You don't get to see the real inner workings of what's really going on, although I did frankly see a little bit of that while I was down there, and I'll tell you, while I was down there, you got to see some of the information about how Fidel Castro actually, when he came to power in Cuba, he was saying that he was trying to overthrow what he called the dictator, which was Fulgencio Batista. And he wanted to get rid of the dictator because the dictator had been there too long, according to him. And then how long did Castro hold power? For something like 60 or 59 or 60 years himself. He had claimed when he was going in, taking power, that he was just going to take power for the people and then he was going to give it up. And that's what you always hear from these communists. That's always their strategy, that they're just going to take power for a short amount of time, restore the will of the people to the country, and essentially they're going to step down. And you know what? In reality, they never do that. The Lenins, the Stalins, they don't leave until they die. Castros, they don't leave until they die. And it'd be the same story here. But, during the break, I wish you could hear some of these conversations we're having during the break, because during the break, Rafael was telling me such an interesting story, and I want you to share that with us, because we were talking about some of your father's captivity and then some of the mindset that they have in these communist countries about how they want to break the will of the prisoners.
Well, you covered it very clear how the state, the communist regime state, becomes the head of everything. Before the church, before family becomes that. And it reminded me of a saying that Lenin, Vladimir Lenin, the founder of communism, in addition to Marx, was that when 5 million Russians died during the famine at the beginning of the Soviet Union, he turned to his pupil Stalin, and Lenin told him, the famine will help us because it'll break the will of the people, and they'll lose their faith in God and bow their head to the communist bloc. And I can imagine it was millions of people that died, men, women, and children that died. And for someone to say that just tells you how diabolical the mindset, the ideology is for this system. But as we spoke in Cuba, we're running back to Cuba, some of the things that these men and women went through, that my father and other men went to Geneva in the 90s and were able to achieve that they condemn these acts, was something called la gavetas. La gavetas is a word in Spanish that's the drawers, the drawers. Mm-hmm. And what it is, they'll make a drawer big enough to fit a human being that you'll lay there, or a closet where it's made out of like steel. So when you're in it and they lock you in and close the door and lock it, you can't stand up because it's about, let's say, 4'10", and you could be 5'7", 6 foot tall, whatever. So you can't stand all the way up. You hit your head. And then if you go to sit down on your bottom, you can't, because the door's right in front of you and your knees will hit. So you can't stand up, can't sit down. Very uncomfortable position.
Yeah.
But what's more uncomfortable, they'll keep you in there for weeks at a time. Weeks at a time.
Yeah.
So you would have your food put through this little hole deposit that they would make, and you have to urinate, you have to defecate, you have to do all those things in that box for weeks at a time.
Oh.
So what would happen is, while you're in there those weeks, you have to do all that. You have to live with the stench. You have to live with just being isolated in that way, in the painful that you can't stand up, you can't sit down for weeks at a time. It just kills your joints. That's why many of these guys got out of there just a mess, in addition to psychologically. There's a little thing at the bottom of the floor where you're using your restroom for weeks, and it's called a pipa. It's like a little pipe.
Yeah.
And they'll turn it on at a certain time of day, and every morning you got to be ready for it. You can't be you got to be very on it. So what happens is when they turn that pipa on and a little bit of water comes out, you have to use that little tin cup and catch that little bit of water. If not, you're going to have no water for the whole day or evening. So they have to make room from all their waste, get that little bit of water, and try to survive for weeks at a time. And when they were taken out of there, it was just horrific.
Yeah.
The stories that you hear. And I saw drawings that they made. Obviously, there's stuff that's come out after the decades, like photographs that finally got out of those because those prisons weren't utilized, and then they just abandoned them and make other prisons. But nonetheless, when you see it, it's something that just sends chills up your spine.
Yeah. Well, it mentally just destroys you. It just breaks your will, and they want you to submit. That's the ultimate goal, is to submit to the communist ideology, submit to the worship of the party and the worship of the state.
Absolutely.
And give up on your old ideas. And we hear that a lot now. People need to give up on these old ideas of freedom and individuality, and you need to submit to your fellow man in some way. But see, that's not what it's about, actually. That's just the propaganda that they try to convince people with, because actually the communists live very well. The leadership, right? The oligarchy that leads actually lives very well. I've seen at a distance, by the way, some of the homes that the Castro brothers lived in.
It's very nice.
They're palatial. I mean, your average person in Cuba today, your average person in Cuba makes the equivalent of at most $30 US. And
Correct.
this runs the whole gamut. This is from, the construction worker all the way up to the person with 3 and 4 PhDs who's a college professor. They all make approximately $30 US. When you're in Old Havana and you see the buildings, nothing's been painted. All of the wiring and electrical wiring is basically done by hand. People have just sort of strung things along, and it's like a huge fire hazard. That's all I was thinking when I was there. The streets will have holes in them. Everything will be opened up. This is the part, by the way, they're trying to keep nice for the tourists.
Yes.
And Pat, you've been there, so you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, real close to the boat area where it docks. It's kind of pretty and clean, but if you walk further down, where a lot of the tourists do not go, it changes quickly.
Yeah.
The world changes.
And so they can't afford to buy a gallon of paint to paint their house, and they haven't been able to for 40 or 50 years. So this is the reality of communism that people don't understand. And here, where they're trying to sell it to our children and trying to sell it to our college students here in the United States, and they're telling them, this is for your fellow man, and don't you want people to have human rights and the ability to have a place to live and things like that. And they just don't tell you the place that you're going to live is not going to be nice, and the food that you're going to have is not going to be good. And hey, by the way, if you then speak up against that, you're going to get put in a box or a drawer for weeks at a time in a terrific. See if I get my words right here. A terrible, horrific conditions. You're going to essentially be tortured, put in solitary confinement, so that they can break your will and reprogram you.
Absolutely. And a lot of these things, when I've spoken to people that were physicians in there, that they used to be attorneys when they had their professions, and they're here, and then I compared their stories to when I went to Romania or Moldova and everything, and it all kind of coincided. So I said, well, what's the problem? Why does Cuba run like that? If it's like supposed to be a socialist paradise, why doesn't it work?
Where's the paradise part?
Yeah, where's the paradise? Why are they running everything, all these old buses that are like jalopy-looking things? Where's the paint? This isn't accidental. This isn't coincidental. This is all part of the makeup of what they do, because when you have so many problems, you don't have time to think about anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Because you need to be a good revolutionary. You need to worry about how making this work and this work. So nothing really works. All their investment, all their energy and effort is on maintaining power. So if nothing works, you have to figure out how to make it ends meet. Yep. If you've got kids at home, you don't have time to organize an organization or a nonprofit to figure out how to change the system. You have to worry about how to feed your kids tomorrow. And if there's tourists coming in, well, you're fortunate enough to live near Havana or the beaches where the tourists are. Well, you need to go figure out how to make some money, because you got the best job in the world, even more than a physician.
Right.
So you don't have time to do anything else, and that's why that's implemented here, in Cuba, Venezuela, and elsewhere.
I can tell you, though, the buses that I saw, they were run by the government. They were the newest, latest buses, but every bit of that money went to the government.
Yeah. Yeah.
All the funds are there. They have the best. I mean, there's been a case where it was reported by an organization here in Florida that one of the granddaughters of the highest ministers there was renting an Airbnb for several $100s a night because it was a nice spot in Havana. But if you go look at some of the other people outside of that 5% of the island, you'll see that they don't have running water. I have family members still that they don't have running water. They pour in a little cup and they bathe themselves that way. Now, they dress up and they're very, very clean people, but nonetheless, they don't have running water, and that's kind of pathetic for this utopia that they try to preach, and this is the reality of it. So again, you see Havana, the tourist part is nice. I've got friends, coworkers that have been. It's nice, but when you go see the reality of the people, you'll see nothing really works. There's no real pension system. They're not taking care of even their own military that believed in and defended that. No one's really taking care of. Nothing works. There is no real social economic program. All that's the hype that they preach, and nothing works.
Yeah. Well, it's the same story in Venezuela, although Venezuela got started later than Cuba. I mean, Venezuela, when Chavez came to power at the end of the 90s, and how in just a short, say about 12 to 20 years, they've totally destroyed that country, ruined what was a beautiful, prosperous country. We've had Norma Camaro-Reno on before on the show, and she's told us some about Venezuela, and she said some very similar things to what you've said, which is that you see the echoes of some of this history. And, of course, Cuba is really the beachhead where communism got going in the Western Hemisphere and near our country. And from Cuba, they have sort of trained and funded a lot of these other countries like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, and other places in our hemisphere in South America where they funded these communist regimes that are now essentially taking over, as we see. We see even today communists being elected in places like Peru and Ecuador and other places in South America. So we see it spreading. It's this insidious political ideology that spreads. Now, but I want to bring it home a little bit and we're going to be running out of time. So, folks, I don't want you to think this is all we're going to have. We're going to have more with Rafael Pizano here in the studio. He's going to come back and tell us some more because he's shared with me some of his briefing materials. And I'm going to tell you, this man has done hundreds of hours of research, and he's connecting dots, things that you're not going to hear about. The local media could be doing this work. Why is this gentleman who has a job, who works, why is he the only one that can connect the dots? Well, the truth is he's not. He's just the only one who wants to connect the dots. The media doesn't want to connect the dots on this because this comes home right here to Tampa. You know, the third largest Cuban community, I believe, in the United States is here in Tampa.
Right here in Tampa Bay.
At one time, I think may have been the largest back when West Tampa was the fifth largest city in the whole state, with our cigar factories and cigar rollers and all the connections that we have here locally to Cuba. But tell us a little bit about some of what the Cuban government is trying to do and how the Communist Party in Cuba has targeted the city of Tampa.
Well, uniquely enough, as the years have gone by and I worked more on this, I started to find some of the characters that I was talking about when I would travel internationally and share what they were doing. They were actually characters that were expelled as diplomats from the United States. They were expelled for espionage. They were expelled for a series of things. It turns out that some of those faces are coming up in photographs for representatives from the city of Tampa, certain businessmen. And I said, what is going on here? The ambassador of Cuba was taking trips here, first quietly and then a little bit more. He started using a little bit more PR as he would come to Tampa. And it's because Tampa has a history with Cuba from the Spanish-American War, where President Theodore Roosevelt had come down when he was a general, went down from Tampa to Cuba, and they helped in the Spanish-American War. That history is something that the communists in Cuba are trying to use as a storyline now to find a bridge to influence and get things that they need. Because right now, there's a lot of disdain against them clearly in the international community. They're not getting their way because they don't play ball. And that's where they try to use Tampa, and I'll explain more later.
Yeah, stick around, folks. We got a lot more on the other side of this break. Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. Boy, we're getting you ready for Christmas here in the right way. We've got, this is, Pat, you said this is one of the best shows we've had in a long time.
It is so interesting, and I'm so happy you're going to have him back.
Yes, we're just getting started, folks. We're barely scratching the surface today, but I wanted to introduce you to my friend Rafael Pizano, and I think we've done a pretty good introduction today, but we haven't gotten into all the details about how some of this connects to Tampa. We do have that on tap. I mean, I've seen his briefing materials. I've seen his dossiers. This man has been doing hundreds of hours, maybe even thousands of hours of research into these subjects, into the people, into these connections, and these pernicious connections are worldwide. We were just talking about how they go to Venezuela, they go to South America, they go to Nicaragua, and other places, and this is all part of the worldwide communist structure to take over, frankly, the United States of America and do away with the last truly free country in the whole world, the one that could stand as a bulwark against international communism like we always have in this country. And they've got to take us down so that China, who's now the leader of the international communist movement, can take over.
Absolutely, and this is Noah's Ark right here in the U.S. After this, what my father and that generation tells me, after this, there's no place to go.
Yeah.
There's no more exile after this. So we have to do everything we can to preserve our way of life here, the American way of life.
Mm-hmm.
What you said about China is interesting. Now I'm going to jump a little bit because Cuba, interestingly enough, over the last 20 years or so, has had in Lutez, Florida, it's a province, a county, let's say, in the mountainside, Lutez, Florida, they have a very sophisticated spy base is what it is. It's run. The Russians, Soviets, Russians, whatever. Back in the 2000s, had about 1,000 techs there.
Okay.
Pretty much that station was utilized by them for email communications, texts, talk, anything like that. They would capture those things there. The Chinese have been there for the last several years. Chinese kind of took over the Russians. They're doing their own thing. They're just whatever. The Chinese have been more aggressive in an international stage, and they're the ones that are running that presence now. So the technology Cuba has right now that has to do with that kind of thing is run by China. They're the ones that are advanced on it. It's not only to control things on the island or figure out any kind of dissent movement or cell phone or to knock out the Wi-Fi like they did last July when the world saw tens of thousands of Cubans took to the streets to finally raise their voice.
Right.
The internet there was a blackout, media blackout. That's because the Chinese sophisticated software is the one that Cuba's using under their tutelage. But that software is utilized for other things. That base extends all the way to Florida. How far in, I'm not sure. This is something that is researchable. I don't have that specific detail, but we do know China is moving that, and they've been aggressive with that as well.
Yeah, it's amazing what China's doing to our country. And again, this is all part of the strategy. It's the divide and conquer strategy. They're flooding our country with drugs like fentanyl, which we see getting mixed into other drugs, and people are dying, overdosing on fentanyl all the time. 99% of the fentanyl that flows into this country, by the way, through the Mexican cartels primarily, flows into this country, comes from China originally. So they're conducting a very sophisticated war against our country. They're conducting war against our children, against our education system. They're playing a divide and conquer strategy on race, which, as we've told you on the show before, and you probably know, that's been part of the Marxist-Leninist strategy to attack America since the 60s. To create racial conflict and division. We'd almost defeated that strategy, and then with President Obama, we took a big step backwards on that, and we got back into a lot of racial politics, identity politics, and now we see that accelerating in front of our very eyes. People have a hard time even believing how much of a step backwards we're taking here in this country. But let's talk some more just briefly, and we're going to run out of time today, but folks, you're going to want to listen into the next show because we're going to have Rafael back really soon. So you're going to want to stick around and keep up with us. We're going to advertise the next show so that you can all be ready and be listening. But let's talk a little bit about some of the efforts they're making here in Tampa because they're actually targeting the Tampa Bay area. The Cuban government, the Communist Party in Cuba, is targeting our area as an outreach area to develop spy networks, to infiltrate our business community, etc. Tell us some about that in the time we've got left.
Interesting enough, some of the characters that come across my work was people that were working as diplomats in Washington. They were expelled, like Gustavo Machine. I'll share his name because once you research that name, anybody wants to take their time to Google it, Gustavo Machine. He was a top-ranking diplomat in Washington for the Cuban regime, the communist regime. He was expelled persona non grata, which pretty much is hey, you got diplomatic immunity, but you need to get up and you need to get out now.
Because you're a spy.
Because you're a spy. And we know you're leading a network along with Josefina Vidal, who's leading certain things in talks in Cuba and so forth. Especially she led the talks when Obama went to Cuba and so forth. They put her there for a reason. He was expelled. He was kicked out. And there was other spies that have been arrested to serve U.S. federal prison time. This guy's the one that's having meetings in Havana where, let's say, former St. Pete Mayor Kreisman would go, and he would always like to publicize how he had strong relations with Cuba. And the reason they got him was because they like to pluck people at these levels versus the senator level or the Washington or international level, because they get these people that don't really know their history, don't know what's going on, and they entice them, they invite them down, wine and dine them, give them the red carpet treatment. So those politicians that are just probably city council members, not known anywhere in the globe, go there, they feel like a dignitary. So when they come back, you know, their ego, their vanity's up.
They're puffed
and
up.
they do a good job. This is what they do down there. They really puff you up. So when they come back, they're enticed to, hey, whatever my friends down in Havana need. And they start doing things that are very irregular, outside of the scope of practice of a city council member that probably runs, you know, one district, or a St. Pete mayor, which St. Pete's a beautiful place, but what does a mayor of St. Pete have to do in Havana and international politics? Well, he should be worrying about what's going on in our backyard. Nonetheless, these people were enticing them, bringing them back, and then I see articles coming out where resolutions are coming out on city councils to kind of move, you know, change U.S. politics, U.S. policy towards Cuba, and we should do a resolution and send it to Washington. Why is a city council that governs pretty much 185 square miles and one district member that leads a small bit of that 185 square miles, why is he propelling resolutions so people can sign off and send to Washington? What does that have to do? Why are they writing letters to the president saying, hey, you should do this and that? And then I'm like, I'm really triggered, and I'm looking into things, and then I see, oh, no wonder that city council member has been doing this for 20 years, propelling things for this regime to their benefit. He has his own interests. He has websites that he's promoting interests like business and so forth. And then I started to connect dots that were right there in front of everybody's eyes, but people didn't know how to connect them. And I started to connect them and see, oh, there's the relations. Oh, here's the photograph in Cuba. And then I have organizations that are human rights organizations in Cuba saying, hey, we got these photographs to send to you. And they send these things to me, and I'm like, oh, wow. That's the guy that served U.S. prison time 13 years in a U.S. federal prison because he was targeting Southcom in South Florida. Southcom, for those that don't know, is similar to MacDill Air Force Base, which led to War and Desert Storm, things of that nature. They have the 5 major branches of the military, the main branches of the military. So these are critical think tanks for the DoD, Department of Defense, right here in Tampa. And you've had council members that are taking pictures with former spies that were released that targeted Southcom, but yet we have MacDill here. I just saw things that didn't add up. I saw them trying to push consulates. Hey, we should open a Cuban consulate. Now, I spoke to a retired colonel by the name of Colonel Chris Simmons that has a very interesting website, amazing work that he's done, counterintelligence for the U.S. Army in relation to Cuba. And his website covers quite a bit of information that shows how they work through consulates to do their espionage job and gain influence. So when they wanted to move a consulate here, I noticed that there was a real clear present threat when city council hasn't asked for risk assessments and so forth.
Right. And we got so much on this, folks. You're going to have to listen in the next week. We're having Rafael Pizano back real soon, folks. Thanks for joining us. I'm Morgan Streetman. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard. And if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.